King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today.
King Charles spent a brief period of time in the hospital today. Britain had heard major royal announcements before, but absolutely nothing quite like this. His abdication plans were already moving forward, and Prince William would become the future king much sooner than anyone had ever expected. Yet Anne's trembling pause suggested the public had heard only a small fraction of the truth. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss a single update. The Princess Royal had arrived that morning for a routine engagement, yet the scheduled programme vanished entirely the moment she unfolded a cream-coloured statement and tightly gripped the lectern. Anne glanced toward the empty chair reserved for Charles before speaking. His Majesty had reached a painful decision that no living sovereign ever wishes to make. Abdication, the formal process through which a monarch gives up the throne, had already begun. She stated the decision plainly. The king believed he could no longer rule effectively, and William was already being prepared to succeed him. Princess Anne felt loyalty pulling her in completely opposite directions. Charles was indeed her older brother, but the crown simply could not survive a transfer of power that was clouded by deep uncertainty. She steadied the page and continued, knowing every word carried public force and intense private pain. Then came the devastating phrase that stunned palace aides: "I cannot rule now." No softened language followed. The monarch's conclusion sounded completely final, and his sister's voice nearly failed as she delivered the words. William had received the warning only minutes earlier in private. He did not sit down or even reach for the document offered to him. The prince simply asked whether his father had personally approved every single word. When told that Charles had indeed done so, he remained completely motionless. His future had suddenly stopped being distant. It had become immediate and incredibly frightening, carrying far more than the official statement the nation had just heard. Beneath that first page rested a second sheet, sealed inside an envelope she never opened. That hidden document contained the precise reason why Charles believed he could not continue, but the princess kept it hidden beneath her hand as phones rose. Broadcasters quickly abandoned scheduled programs. The words "Charles Abdication" raced nationwide before she even stepped away. A senior courtier met Anne beside the exit and whispered that William had completely refused to enter the throne room, the formal chamber associated with the sovereign's authority, until he faced Charles alone. She closed her eyes for one long second, understanding that this growing national crisis had already become a raw family confrontation that could destroy their fragile trust. But before Britain could fully understand why a king was preparing to surrender the crown, the family itself had to confront exactly what each of them stood to lose. Behind those grand titles were three real people facing a decision no ceremony could soften. Charles was not merely a sovereign considering a sudden abdication. He was a father preparing to hand his life's purpose to his eldest son. William was not simply an heir to the throne. This was a man being suddenly summoned toward a destiny he had expected to approach slowly, and Anne had become the messenger forced to wound them both. Charles sat alone with the abdication draft spread across his desk. Abdication meant the formal, permanent surrender of the throne, but to him it felt far more deeply personal than any legal definition could ever explain. He had spent almost his entire life preparing to become king, enduring decades of constant public judgment, expectation and relentless waiting. Now the signature line remained untouched. He removed his glasses, pressed his fingers against his eyes, and stared at the page, as though signing it would erase the very purpose that had shaped him. William felt absolutely no sense of victory. The prince had prepared for kingship ever since childhood, yet he had always believed precious time remained between that preparation and reality. Catherine watched him straighten his cuffs over and over before meeting his father, recognizing the small gesture he always used whenever real fear threatened to show. She knew accession the moment an heir formally becomes monarch would not only change his title, It would completely transform their children's lives, their home, their freedom, and every ordinary moment the family still possessed. Anne carried an entirely different burden. She deeply resented being trapped between her brother and nephew, yet she also knew exactly why Charles had chosen her. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had built her solid reputation on sheer directness and duty. She could deliver a painful truth without ever turning it into theatre. Still, every sentence she had spoken publicly felt like a raw wound, inflicted on two men she loved, and she feared neither would forgive her easily. Camilla learned through a documented palace briefing that Anne had been trusted with making the announcement instead of her. The Queen Consort remained silent at first, then quietly asked exactly when the final decision had been made. Her question carried far more than mere anger. It carried the dark fear that private discussions about Charles's future had taken place entirely without the woman closest to him. William found the shocking answer right inside that first draft. Charles had actually begun writing the abdication language weeks earlier, proving this was not a sudden collapse or just one emotional decision. A handwritten date appeared right beside the opening paragraph. The future king read it twice, then looked toward Catherine. With a sudden change in his face, she immediately understood. That specific date belonged to one royal ceremony, one hidden moment, and one private failure his own father had never once confessed. This date led straight back to a ceremony everyone remembered for its sheer grandeur, but only a handful of people understood as the beginning of the end. The monarchy did not begin to fracture on the day Anne spoke. The true turning point came weeks earlier during a ceremony designed to display absolute confidence, continuity, and control. Charles entered beneath thundering applause, deeply determined to prove that the crown remained steady. But before that event even finished, a private whisper in a narrow side room left him deeply shaken, forcing him to start drafting the very abdication paper that would soon terrify all of Britain. Charles had stubbornly insisted on going to the Commonwealth Unity Service, completely ignoring warnings that the exhausting schedule might push him way past his physical limits. This formal gathering, celebrating cooperation between Britain and other Commonwealth nations, was supposed to project a sense of absolute stability during an incredibly delicate moment. William and Anne had actually been talking about scaling back the king's schedule, fearing another public struggle would destroy his remaining confidence and shatter public trust. Yet the monarch felt a distinct chill in their worry. He suspected his son and sister were quietly plotting to push him aside. Anne knew there was trouble the moment the final procession ended. Charles stepped into the quiet room off St. George's Hall, stared at the closed doors and asked why the ceremony had not even started. The princess froze in her tracks. The entire procession had already ended. With no press or staff near enough to step in, she took her brother gently by the arm and quietly told him where they were. The king stared at her, panic cracking his royal composure. He whispered that he should never have been out there. Anne felt those whispered words hit her harder than any public accusation ever could. Charles frantically asked if anyone had noticed his confusion, but she refused to soothe him with a lie. She admitted that a few people saw him hesitate, even if they did not understand why. William walked in seconds later, finding his father pressing both hands against a table just to steady himself. The prince took a step forward, but the monarch sharply snapped, "Do not touch me." William stopped, deeply hurt by the rejection, while Charles quickly turned away in pure shame. Later, a top royal doctor delivered a highly private assessment through a formal medical briefing. The doctor did not demand he step down, but warned that constant strain would trigger more unpredictable public episodes. That warning carried immense weight, because just one more moment of confusion would raise serious questions about whether the king could actually handle his constitutional duties. The official duties of the sovereign, Charles listened without a single protest. That quiet silence terrified Anne far more than a sudden outburst of anger. That very night, Charles called for his secretary and began dictating his formal abdication statement. The private logs showed that the king hesitated for a long moment before ordering the document to be dated. It was that exact same handwritten date William eventually found inside the secret file. When the prince finally learned about the panic in the side room, his grief turned straight into cold anger. He did not blame his father for stumbling. He blamed him for carrying that terrifying weight entirely alone, hiding the truth from his family. That hidden incident explained the sudden choice, but it could not stop the explosive fight that erupted when father and son finally faced each other without any scripts or handlers. No cameras, no staff, and certainly no polite phrasing remained when William entered the king's private room. Those unsigned abdication papers sat between them like absolute proof of a betrayal. Charles truly believed he was shielding his son from an agonizing burden. But William felt his father had stripped away his right to stand right beside him. What started as a quiet question rapidly became the most agonizing confrontation either man had ever faced. William shut the heavy door and set the dated draft down on the table. The prince had arrived right after Anne's announcement, deeply hurt that the public seemed to know just as much about the plan as he did. He told his father directly that he had decided the entire future of his family without even talking to him first. Charles stared down at the paper, unable to meet his son's eyes. He had convinced himself that keeping this secret would protect a few final weeks of normal life for William, Catherine and their kids before heavy royal duties took over. Charles finally looked up. He accused William of treating his stepping down as a mere constitutional puzzle. It was a formal surrender of the throne, yes, but the king insisted it also meant stripping away the sole purpose he had waited decades to fulfill. The future king shot back sharply that he was not looking at some constitutional problem. He was looking at a terrified father who had simply refused to trust his own son. Those words shattered the tight control both men had struggled to keep. Charles shoved his chair back so hard it slammed right into the cabinet behind him. Pure rage flared across his face, then immediately dissolved into bone-deep exhaustion. He collapsed into another chair and bitterly accused William of thinking he was already fully prepared to replace him. The prince recoiled in shock. His voice cracked as he confessed he had always pictured his father standing right beside him at his eventual accession, the exact moment an heir officially becomes the reigning monarch, not surrendering the crown in sorrow before that day came. William stepped forward, but Charles raised a hand to stop him. The king then admitted, according to their private records, that he had seriously looked into setting up a regency. A regency lets another royal take over daily duties when the monarch cannot fully rule, but legal experts warned that William would end up carrying the massive weight of kingship without actually holding its full undisputed authority. Charles refused to trap his own son between duty and actual power, even if this abdication deeply wounded them both. Anne stepped inside only when their shouting reached the hallway outside. The princess looked from her brother to her nephew, telling them both that the massive machinery of succession was already running. This official transfer of the crown was completely unstoppable now. News stations were waiting, palace officials were preparing. More delay would not protect their family. It would only trigger an unprecedented national crisis. Slowly Charles picked up his pen and signed the first page, leaving the final legal document untouched. William watched him lay the pen aside, knowing this rare moment of honesty had not ended the war. It had simply pushed the real battle far outside this private room. The family had finally spoken the truth to one another, but outside that shut door, powerful officials were already deciding if Charles even had the power to control his own exit. Kings might wear the heavy crowns, but moments of handover are shaped in much quieter rooms. While Charles and William fought as father and son, top constitutional advisors and senior royals calculated every fallout of abdication. Just one signature would instantly change the king, the heir, the children's titles, and the entire rhythm of the government. And yet the most powerful person in that crowded room was someone nobody in the palace ever expected. Anne sat silently at the far end of the council table with that unread second page resting right beside her. This council was the small group coordinating both the legal and highly practical steps. of transferring royal authority, and absolutely everyone around that table understood Charles's private wish now had to become a formal constitutional action. Palace officials couldn't simply announce William's name and hope tradition somehow carried the rest. Government briefings, public oaths, tight security arrangements, and royal titles. And scheduled appearances all had to change at once, because one tiny delay or contradiction could make the crown look divided when they desperately needed control. Then William walked in, silently taking the empty chair directly opposite his aunt. A senior advisor slowly slid the final timetable toward him, but the prince refused to even touch the paper. Anne watched his hand tighten hard against the edge of the table before quietly telling him his father wanted him to read it, as his son first and as his successor second. He finally opened the heavy file. Accession. That crucial moment when an heir legally becomes the new sovereign could happen in a matter of days, leaving almost zero time for private grief before his heavy public duty began. Camilla confronted the private secretary right outside the chamber after discovering the proposed transition plan gave her only a very limited ceremonial role once Charles stepped down from the throne. The Queen Consort demanded to know who had actually decided her future without ever consulting her first. She argued that they had reduced the king to a mere constitutional problem when he was also a husband, losing his identity, his purpose, and his authority. The secretary answered through a documented palace account that the transition plan followed Charles's own direct instructions. Camilla fell silent, then quietly asked why he had trusted Anne with those final orders instead of her. Princess Anne finally opened the second sealed page at last. Charles had requested a rapid transfer of power without any farewell tour or long public goodbye. He genuinely feared that further public appearances could expose another moment of confusion, turning his final days as sovereign into an absolute humiliation. That request instantly changed the room. This was not merely royal strategy, it was a frail man desperately trying to protect what little remained of his dignity. William reached the very last paragraph and looked directly toward Anne. The document gave her, and not him, Camilla, or any advisor, the ultimate authority to stop the timetable if Charles showed any uncertainty before signing the final instrument. The princess understood that terrible weight immediately. She was being asked to judge whether her own brother still truly meant to go through with the decision that would end his reign. Long before dawn, Anne received a highly private message from Charles. It contained only 6 simple words: "Come alone, we need to speak." She stared down at the screen, wondering whether he wanted reassurance, deep forgiveness, or some kind of way back. Anne had carried her brother's monumental decision before the entire nation, but now she had to discover whether he still possessed the raw strength to actually complete it. By sunrise, the quiet palace no longer felt like the home of a reigning king. Staff spoke in hushed, lowered voices, files were swept from desks, and William's name began appearing on briefings he had never expected to receive quite so soon. The crown had not officially changed hands, and yet everyone inside the palace was already living with the consequences. For Charles, the most painful proof came when he watched that familiar red box being carried right past his closed door. Royal staff had already begun separating the key documents that still required Charles's approval from those that would pass directly to William after the accession. The legendary red dispatch box that locked leather case, used to carry highly confidential government papers to the sovereign, had always represented ultimate responsibility, trust, and royal power. Now an aide carried it toward another room. The king stepped out into the corridor and quietly asked where it was going, and the aide froze in panic before admitting the prince was being prepared for an emergency briefing. Charles said absolutely nothing. He simply returned to his bedroom, closed the door, and kept one hand resting on the brass handle long after the corridor outside had fallen completely silent. Planned public engagements were already being quietly cancelled. Official palace communications were being completely rewritten, and senior representatives had been strictly ordered not to contradict Anne's public announcement. That mattered deeply because one uncertain message could make the transition appear forced, while a single careless appearance could expose the private physical weakness the family had worked so desperately to contain. Camilla found Charles still standing frozen near the door. The Queen Consort softly told him that he could still withdraw before the final document was signed. She insisted that the entire royal machinery could be stopped, even if doing so deeply embarrassed the palace. He looked at her with a look of quiet pain, saying that remaining on the throne merely because he feared becoming irrelevant would betray the crown itself. Camilla reached out for him, but the king moved slowly toward the heavy desk, where the unsigned instrument waited like a final judgment. William entered the new briefing room and saw the sovereign's private papers arranged before an unfamiliar chair, and the prince firmly refused to sit down. He clearly told the waiting officials that Charles remained the true monarch until the abdication was complete, and that he would not behave like a king while his father still carried that title. And yet those documents stayed right in place, reminding him that the vast palace institution had already begun preparing for his inevitable arrival. Anne answered Charles's private summons and found him standing right beside the final instrument, the legal document that would formally end his reign, with a sealed letter addressed to William resting beside it. The princess quietly asked whether he had changed his mind, and he answered during their recorded private conversation that losing the throne no longer frightened him in the slightest. What truly terrified him was the painful thought that his son might remember the accession as something stolen from a weakened father, and Anne understood that deep wound immediately. William could easily inherit the authority, but a bitter resentment might follow him into his reign unless Charles spoke to him before that final signature made everything official. She gently told her brother that no palace advisor grand ceremony or official document could ever repair that pain. Only one honest face-to-face conversation could do it. Anne arranged one last meeting, absolutely no aides, no palace officials, and no other family members standing between them. Before the crown could legally hand over Charles, and William had to figure out what remained between them as father and son. This crucial moment did not play out before some royal council or under glowing palace chandeliers. Instead, it happened in a cramped room with just 2 chairs, a cold fireplace, and nobody around to translate raw pain into polite royal language. Charles walked in holding the final signing document. William stepped inside carrying years of heavy expectations. For the very first time since this crisis erupted, neither man spoke as king or heir. They just spoke as a tired father letting go and a son quiet with fear about taking his place. Anne shut the heavy door and walked away. The princess had intentionally stripped away every single barrier of state, knowing officials could make this transfer efficient, but only real honesty could make it bearable. Abdication, that heavy legal process where a monarch surrenders the throne, could protect the crown from dangerous public uncertainty. But William knew that saving the institution would mean almost nothing if his relationship with Charles fell apart under the crushing weight of a transition that felt like a total defeat. Charles held out a sealed envelope addressed directly to his son. He quietly asked William not to open the letter until after the accession, the exact moment the heir legally becomes king. The prince slid it inside his breast pocket rather than leaving it out on the table. It was a silent promise to keep his father's words close. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the king finally admitted what his stubborn pride had kept hidden. During their intimate conversation, Charles confessed that he had deeply envied the fierce confidence with which William protected Catherine and their young children. He had so often let duty crush his own feelings, believing that hard sacrifice was the only way to prove loyalty. Now he feared he had made the exact same mistake by hiding his pain. The prince listened in complete silence, but his face tightened with a deep pain when his father called abdication a failure. William walked over, kneeling right beside Charles's chair to look him directly in the eyes, not as a subject bowing, but as a son who refused to let shame define his father's final choice. He told his father he would only accept the crown if the king stopped calling this hard decision a defeat. He would carry the heavy public burden of the throne, but he refused to build his new reign upon Charles's deep humiliation. Charles finally understood. He whispered that this abdication was not a surrender, it was actually his very last act of service. It was a brave decision to put the monarchy into the hands of someone strong enough to face its massive demands. William promised his father would never be hidden away after stepping down. He would still be a counsellor, a dedicated public servant, and above all, a father whose real value no royal title could ever erase. Charles pulled the final signing paper toward him. He signed, put down the pen, and reached out for William's hand. The prince held it tightly. Neither spoke because the heavy silence was no longer filled with anger. Instead it held forgiveness. Right outside the door, Anne received confirmation that the painful decision was finally made. Within minutes, anxious palace staff prepared the official statement, totally unsure whether Britain would react with grief, deep respect, fear, or sudden hope. The signature locked in the future inside the palace walls, but outside the gates, an entire nation prepared to figure out what that future actually meant. The news spread faster than royal tradition could ever move. Tolling church bells, flashing news banners, packed pavements, and quiet living rooms all quickly became part of the exact same national moment. Many Britons mourned the sudden end of a reign that had only just begun. Others saw William's takeover as the fresh start the monarchy desperately needed. But one image outside Buckingham Palace captured the country's split heart far more than any speech. Television networks abruptly suspended regular programming, calling this sudden abdication the most dramatic royal transition of the modern era. The act of abdication, the formal surrender of the crown, was no longer just some secret palace plan discussed behind closed doors. It was now a national reality. Newspapers scrambled to print historic morning editions, trying to balance sympathy for Charles with the overwhelming expectations instantly loaded onto William. Every front-page headline carried that same painful tension. One man was stepping aside in quiet agony, while another was shoved toward duty before he felt truly ready. Right outside Buckingham Palace, an elderly man walked up to the iron railings and slipped a handwritten card against them. "Thank you, Charles. Stand strong, William," it read. A little girl standing next to him left 2 flowers, one for each king, before asking her mother if the older monarch would still be allowed to be part of the family. That question spread through the crowd because it captured what millions were feeling right then. Britain was not just losing a sovereign, it was watching a tired father make room for his son. A major newspaper printed a stark cover showing Charles and William walking side by side under the headline, "A Father's Last Duty." The stark image shifted the public mood. Debates softened into quiet reflection as people began to view the decision not as a defeat but as a sacrifice. Yet the hope surrounding the new prince carried its own heavy burden. He would inherit authority, massive scrutiny, and deep responsibility at the exact moment he was grieving the end of his father's reign. Anne watched the crowd from a quiet palace window. The princess had feared anger and open division, but instead she heard applause rising for Charles. Relief washed over her face, followed by tears she quickly brushed away. Her sudden announcement had wounded her brother in public, yet the nation genuinely seemed to understand the courage behind his painful choice. Camilla heard a broadcaster talk about Charles's reign in the past tense, before the handover ceremony had even taken place. The Queen Consort quietly switched off the television. She could accept the cold legal process, but she absolutely could not bear hearing her husband discussed, as though his lifetime of service had already become history. The palace finally put out written confirmation that this decision was entirely voluntary, final, and fully supported by William, putting an end to wild claims that the crown had been forced from Charles. The prince then issued a video statement thanking his father not just for his reign, but for placing the monarchy above personal pride. Public uncertainty finally began to settle. Just one final ceremony remained. Charles would have to walk away and William would have to accept what could no longer be postponed. Britain already knew this short reign was over. Now, behind closed doors, the family faced the exact second one man stopped being king, and another stepped up to carry the heavy future of the crown. No one was celebrating this final handoff of power. Charles walked away from the very crown he had spent a whole lifetime waiting to wear. William accepted a destiny that came wrapped in his father's raw pain. Anne stood right between them, no longer just the messenger of a crisis, but the sole witness to a massive, painful sacrifice. As those final words echoed, the family realized that letting go took far more courage than trying to hold on. Charles signed the final document before the quiet witnesses. The abdication paper, the official document ending his entire reign, sat right under his hand for one last second before he laid down the pen. Then he picked it up and handed it directly to Anne. He did not make a speech. He did not have to. His sister had carried the heavy truth when he could not, absorbing the public anger and shielding the entire family from a much uglier collapse. William stepped forward after the official declaration. Everyone expected the new king to show nothing but royal restraint. Instead, William did not even bow. He hugged his father. Charles held on to him tightly, and for just a second the crown did not matter. Duty called them back, but everyone in that room knew the crown had passed through quiet healing, not a bitter palace struggle. In his final recorded message, Charles admitted his reign had cut short much sooner than he had ever dreamed. The former king knew that staying on without the strength to rule would only serve his pride, not his country. William took over with absolutely no celebration. He promised his reign would honour his father's service while bringing fresh stability, transparency, and a real sense of purpose to a monarchy shaken by sudden change. Anne watched them both, her face showing a mix of grief and pride. She felt no easy relief her brother had lost his identity and her nephew was inheriting a crushing burden. Still, she knew that telling the truth had saved both of them. Camilla stayed close to Charles's side as he walked out, knowing their entire world had just shifted forever. The Queen Consort quietly mourned what he had to give up, yet she also knew the heavy load that had started to crush him was finally gone. Later, William opened the private letter alone. Charles did not leave behind any constitutional rules or lectures on how to rule. He wrote only a simple apology, his immense pride in his son, and one last warning. Do not become the crown so completely that you lose the human being underneath. The new king folded the paper slowly, taking on not just a heavy throne, but the hard lesson hidden in his father's pain. This abdication was not some tragic failure, it was actually his last and his most selfless decision as king, giving up power before more uncertainty could damage the institution he was sworn to protect. Anne's message shocked the country by exposing the crown's heavy human cost. Still, Charles left with his dignity. William stepped into the light with quiet compassion. The crown survived because one generation found the strength to trust the next. The short reign of King Charles ended, but definitely not in disgrace. It ended with a father letting go of the throne, a son taking on its heavy weight, and a family showing the world that their greatest strength was actually sacrifice. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of these untold royal stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button.